happy to welcome you back to another Blender for Scientists tutorial. In this tutorial, I would like to show you a couple of modifiers that you can use to style your protein or your biomolecule a bit differently. All of those modifiers can be used to give your scene a quite unique look. In that part, I would like to focus on three modifiers. One that is the Wireframe Modifier, the other one is the Remesh Modifier, and then we are going to have a look to the Solidify Modifier. If you're only interested in one of those modifiers, you can just use the timestamps and directly jump into that section. But before we start, I would like to give you an overview on what the scene that I'm currently set up looks like. Then we are going to import the biomolecule, and then we are going to start with the modifiers. The scene that I decided to set up is a quite light, pastel-y looking like scene. This is something that I'm currently into. I really enjoy those kind of color combinations, and is really simple. So you see that here is my camera. Then I have just two very simple planes that give a backdrop and also like a floor, so to say. And then I have two lights. Those are very simple point lights with a quite large radius, and they are colored. So you see the left one is blue, the right one has a pinkish kind of tone to it. And when we import our biomolecule, you will see what that setup looks like if there is an object there. I prepared my biomolecule in Chimera. I used an enzyme that I was working with during my PhD time, so an enzyme that is very familiar to me and it's easy for me to work with that. And I exported it as a Collada file. And this is what I'm going to import. In the tutorial where I show you how to deal with Collada files or importing from Chimera, you can get all the details about that. I'm just going to quickly do those modifications that I normally do all the time. So you see that you get a couple of things imported from Chimera. Those are free light sources and do nodes. There is a camera node as well. And I'm just going to delete all of them. That changes the position of my molecule, but that's fine. So this is nothing to worry about. If you followed the tutorial already, you know that all of our objects are actually imported as separate objects, and that is quite nasty to deal with. And this is something that I would like to fix first. So I'm going to select the surface first, because this is just one solid object, and I'm going to hide it. Underneath my surface, you see that I decided to also create a ribbon-like structure file as well. The disadvantage here is that you see that all of those parts of that ribbon are selectable separately. This is not something that I would like to have because it gives me a lot of objects here. So to grab all of these objects quickly, I'm going to go into Select and select Group, and I'm going to select Link, and I'm going to select them by material. The surface has the same material as our structural information underneath it, but since we hide our surface, that's not going to be selected. Then I'm just going to click on one of the objects so that it is highlighted as light orange, and by using Ctrl J, all of those objects are grouped into one. And this is now that object over there. I'm also going to rename the object so it's easier to identify them. So that was the surface, and that was my ribbon. And I'm also going to hide the ribbon, because what's left now is just the cofactor that was inside of the active site. So I'm going to select it, group it as well, and also name it cofactor. Great. So if I show everything again, then we can select all of the objects. I'm going to go into Object, Set Origin to Geometry, so it's easier to navigate. Then first of all, I'm going to scale the object because it's way too large. I'm going to jump into the front view so that I can find the nice position in that direction. And if I jump into the top view, I can also move it along here. And then we are approximately where we would like to be already. So I'm going to just find the fine tuning. So I'm of course going to position it in front of my backdrop, move it up a bit, scale it down a bit, and then apply a bit of rotation to everything so that I find a nice position. So there should be, there it is. There is an entry into the active site. So I would like to look into the active site. And I'm also going to move it down a bit so that a bit of the surface is actually touching the plane. And then I'm also going to do a bit of rotation because I would like to have more of the surface actually to be closer to the plane. And then let's check how that looks. Yeah. So you see we have our surface here and a nice view into the active site and also a nice shadow on the floor. There is something that I forgot to mention when I talked about how I set up the scene. I also used an add-on that is available for Blender. You just need to activate it. So you go into Edit Preferences and then look for, I just type Sky, and then activate Lighting Dynamic Sky, which gives you a Create tab over here, and there you can activate a global sky lighting. That is normally a very soft lighting, and this is also something that I activated. You can copy the values that I adjusted here or just play around with it a bit more and find the kind of lighting that you want. And that's basically it. So you see, now we have our molecule. There is one thing that I'm going to quickly change as well, because I know that happens when I import from Chimera. For that, I'm going to hide my cofactor and I'm going to hide my ribbon visualization and just stay with the surface. There are normally some blobs in between the surface. So there is, of course, empty space inside of the surface, and there are some cavities there, and those cavities are also shown. In my case, you can see them if I jump to the wireframe view. So in my case, I would like to get rid of those, and that can be easily done with selecting your surface, going into the edit mode, select everything, press P for separate and say separate by loose parts. Then you see we get all the cavities that are on the inside by tab. By using tab, you can leave the edit mode again, select just the surface on the outside, hide that again, and then you are left with all the other objects. And I'm going to lock my lights so that I don't select them with that. And then with box select, you can just select all the cavities that were on the inside and delete them. And then I can show all the single objects again. The first modifier, as I promised, is going to be one that helps you to display the surface in a mesh way. If you are used to working with Pymol, for example, this is a feature that you know from Pymol already. In Blender, you have a modifier that does exactly that. So you go into the modifier properties and just say add modifier, and in the generate tab, the last one is called wireframe. And if you select that, you get a wireframe, a mesh that shows your surface. If I jump into the rendered view again, we see my scene is super light, so it's really hard to see what is happening there. So I'm quickly going to give my my mesh a bit of a darker color so that we see what we are working with. The color or the material of the mesh is also linked to the material of our ribbon. So I'm going to keep it like that, but you see that our mesh is really fine, and this is something I would like to change. So in the modifier tab, you can modify or change the thickness of your mesh, and I'm going to actually go for 0.2 and see how that looks. And there is also something that that is visible now. It was not visible before because the mesh was just too fine. And those are those weird streaks or needles that come out of our mesh. That's some sort of, I think, artifact that is still there, but that can be solved really easily by just selecting the mesh and for the thickness, untick even. And as soon as you do that, the mesh is a bit finer again, but all of those streaks are gone. So in that case, I'm going to make my mesh even thicker. That helps, of course, to show the geometry of your object. So if I go for a finer mesh, so if I go back again, 0.2 for example, or even 0.1, you see that the information of the geometry gets lost because you don't have the shadows that you normally have if you have a tighter mesh. You can simulate that by just having a higher thickness to get a tighter mesh. Or there would be another option on how to achieve that as well while keeping a thinner mesh. For that, we are going to use another modifier that we are going to apply in combination with a wireframe. The nice thing about modifiers in general is that you can combine them and they are not permanently set on your objects. That means if I would like to get rid of my wireframe modifier, I can just delete it by using the X and then it's gone. So it does not do any kind of permanent modification on your object. And that is really convenient to have, especially if you're just looking for a style. A modifier that works quite well in combination with the wireframe is the Subdivision Surface Modifier. That just gives you a smoother representation of your surface. This is a modifier I use very often just because the resolution, how it comes from Chimera, from Biomolecule, and so on and so forth, is sometimes not enough to give a very smooth visualization. Depending on how complex your objects are, it might take a bit for the modifier to appear or to calculate, basically. And on top of your subsurface modifier, you can now put the wireframe modifier. That again takes a bit of time to calculate. It is a good idea to first do the subdivision and then do the wireframe. Otherwise, the calculation might take very long or Blender might even crash. Now I have to do the same thing as I did before for the wireframe. So untick even to get rid of those streaks and then modify the thickness. And now you can see, if I zoom in, the wire is now way finer and way more defined actually. And we don't have to use an overly large or an overly high value for the thickness in order to get that kind of effect. And then of course you can also take care of the styling. So now I can make my molecule a bit lighter again to nicely blend in with my light sources. And that would be then the outcome for the wireframe modifier. Modifiers give a different results depending on their order. So if you have subdivision first, wireframe afterwards, this is going to be the outcome. But of course, you could also just grab the wireframe modifier and put it on top of your surface. Before you do that, I would recommend that you save your file first because it might crash Blender basically. So this is also something I'm going to do quickly. And then I'm going to switch places for those two modifiers and let's see what the outcome is going to be. Be warned, this is going to take a bit of calculation. So I'm going to come back whenever that is finished. So for me, I did not stop the time exactly, but I think it was 1 minute or so. And then that is the outcome now. So if I zoom in, you see that the mesh looks quite different now. I prefer the first version of the modifier, to be honest, so I'm going to go back with that again. So this again might take a bit, but I'm going to leave that calculate while I mention something else that is also important. You see in the Subdivision Surface Modifier tab, oh, that actually went a bit quicker than the other way around. So in the Subdivision Surface Modifier tab, you have two numbers that you can change here. One is for the viewport, so what we are currently seeing, and the other one is the number for the rendered outcome. In that case, always make sure that those numbers are the same. For the rendered version, you should also have 1 in that case. I'm just going to show you quickly what happens if you don't set that to the same number. So if I render that image quickly, also keep in mind that rendering objects with a Subdivision Surface Modifier takes way longer, of course, because there is more information that needs to be calculated. So you even see starting up the scene or starting up the rendering takes already quite long. What you see here is now that the mesh is way finer than what we have in our viewport, and the reason for that is because another layer of subdivision is applied. While when I'm going to stop that, so if I change that to 1 and render again, the outcome should be the same as it is in our viewport. So let's wait for that quickly. Here it comes. Yeah, so now you see that the mesh is exactly the same as the one that we have in our viewport. So this is something to keep in mind. If your final render looks different, that might be the cause. Good, so that would be the wireframe modifier. As I mentioned, you can just delete those modifiers by just using X. I'm going to keep my subdivision modifier because I think it gives a nicer visualization anyways. And I'm also going to apply that modifier. So if you would like to keep that modifier permanently, you can just hit apply. Then it is going to be removed from your tab here and it is going to be permanently applied to your object. You can, of course, apply the modifier to any other object that you have in your scene as well. So, for example, for our ribbon here and also for our molecule. So both of those things are possible, of course. I think for a molecule, it does not make overly much sense because you really lose a lot of information here. So I would not recommend that. But for the ribbon, that might definitely be something that you're looking for. So that would be the wireframe modifier. Let's move on to the next one. That would be the Remesh modifier. I'm going to apply the remesh again on my surface. So I'm going to select the surface, go into the Add Modifier tab, and then click on Remesh. Remesh is just going to take your current visualization and modifies it depending on what kind of remesh that you select here. And one that I would like to highlight because it gives a quite funny and quite unique look as well is the blocks version. So what that does is it just remeshes your smooth mesh into a block-like visualization. And by increasing the value of depth here, you get a finer version of it. And if I go into the rendered mode, it is a bit easier to see what's happening here. So you get a very low-res version of your biomolecules. So, of course, by increasing the number here, those single blocks get smaller and you get a higher resolution. But I think this is also a very unique way on how to represent the surface in that case, a quite artistic one. So it's not about scientifically accurate visualization, but that is, I think, a quite funny one, a quite funny way on how to represent the surface. You can play with the values here, with the scale value. So if I go down with the scale, for example, then my blocks are going to be larger again. So those two values are somehow competing with each other, and just find the perfect setting for that kind of modifier here. So this is again just a quick modifier that gives you a remesh of your biomolecule. Again, if you don't like it, you can just delete it and it's gone. Same thing as before. If you would like to apply it for a different object, you can select that, go to Remesh again. So for our ribbon, I'm going to go for the blocks again. Now, of course, if your blocks are too small, it doesn't show up. So in that case, you would have to go to a rather high number. So if 7 for me works already. I would even go a bit higher to have that kind of block-like or low-res version of your ribbon in that case as well. Of course, it would also work for our cofactor, but you can play with that as well if you have a molecule incorporated. Again, if we don't want to keep it, I can just delete it and it's gone. So that would be the Remesh modifier. You saw that for the Remesh modifier, it is not only, you cannot only modify it concerning blocks, but also there is a smooth option. And I'm going to go for this into the solid view because it's easier to see what happens here. So that gives you also a low-res version, but you see that it looks a bit different here. So in that case, your low-res mesh is just made out of squares, basically. That might also be a way on how to get a different type of wireframe. So if we add a wireframe modifier on top of that, you can get a different set or a different mesh, basically. And by just increasing the number here, your mesh is going to get finer again. And it looks a bit different than the wireframe modifier that we had at the beginning. So that would be a different look by just combining those two modifiers. So I'm going to remove that one again. And the last modifier, and also I'm going to remove the remesh. The last modifier that I would like to show you is for our ribbon that we have here. So if you have that kind of ribbon style object imported, but you are unsure about how thick your ribbon should be, so you would like to have a thicker visualization, then you can also change that in Blender by applying another modifier, which is called the Solidify Modifier. You saw that when I first showed you, or when we imported the ribbon actually, that it is built out of single pieces, and all of those single pieces and cuts are showing now. This is actually, to be honest, a quite unique look. So you see, I'm also going to change the color of the ribbon to something a bit darker. Let's even give it a bit of a color maybe, so that we see more of the details. And those kind of cuts are nicely visible here. And by increasing the thickness of our Solidify modifier, we can actually enhance that. So I'm going to go into the solid mode so that you can follow along what happens here. So now you see that we can make those the ribbons, including those cuts, quite thick. What I experienced is that sometimes there are some glitches here when you have quite steep loops, and that gives very unpleasant holes in that kind of mesh. That can be circumvented by just using a negative value for the thickness. Then of course it gets a bit larger, so you need to lower the value again, but then those kind of glitches are gone. So if I go into the rendered mode again, you see that that would be actually the outcome by applying a Solidify modifier here. Again, if you want to, you can also combine the Solidify modifier with a Wireframe modifier, something I'm going to quickly try. Make the same adjustments as I had at the beginning, and that also gives you a quite unique look actually. Don't forget to untick even. Now it's gone. So now you see that gives you a quite unique look as well. So I really enjoy that kind of visualization actually. I think it's really, it looks really cool. I'm going to remove the wireframe. If you would like to have a ribbon that does not have those kind of cuts, we can also fix that. For that, I'm going to not delete our modifier, but I'm going to hide it so that we are going to jump back to our original view. I'm going to also do that in the solid view. Select our ribbon, go into the edit mode by hitting Tab, hit A to select everything, and then go into Mesh, Clean Up, and Merge by Distance. So this is going to create new connections between those gaps that we had previously. If I jump into the object mode again and activate our Solidify modifier, now you can see that all of those gaps are actually gone. And we have a smooth visualization of that kind of very thick version of the ribbon. Also, we can apply the wireframe back again, because I don't know why, but I think the wireframe and the ribbon combination really gives a unique look. So that would be the outcome of our ribbon in combination with a wireframe. So you really see that that is a quite trippy and quite fancy effect that you can apply on your biomolecules here. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, that kind of visualization is nothing that you would put into a publication, for example, but it might well be something that you might want to put on a journal cover design. Good, so that would be basically it. 3 quick tips, 3 quick modifiers that you can apply. I hope that gives you already quite some ideas on how to style your scenes again by just using a modifier. With this, I would like to end it here. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that I see you in the next tutorial as well.